This is a painting of Newport's 11s of the Lafayette Escadrille. These were American pilots that volunteered for the French before, well, long before the United States got into the war in 1917. This would be approximately 1915. It's an early French fighter, very agile, and it was eventually replaced by other Newports as the war progressed. This is a painting of a Bristol fighter and a Fokker D7, totally fictional, made it up. It was just for fun, but I wanted to paint the Bristol fighter, and why not have him fighting a Fokker D7? This is pretty pulp magazine-ish, and that was the point of the whole thing. But it was a fun painting to do. It's in a collection of a fellow artist. This is a painting of a Fokker D7 closing in on a Sopwith Camel. The end results of this are unknown because they were both very, very flyable aircraft that could dogfight quite well. This painting happened to be done for John Jenkins, a model maker from China, who happened to be making a model of that particular Fokker D7 at the time the painting was done, and it was gifted to him. Another painting of a Newport, but this is while it's a French aircraft, it was flown by the British, and this one was flown by Albert Ball, the British ace. And it's noted. You can note that by the blue nose cone on the front of the aircraft. These are Sopwith Dolphins, and they're a British aircraft made by the same company that made the Sopwith Camel. And it looks as though they're about ready to tangle with a couple of Fokker D7s. These particular Sopwith Dolphins were flown by Americans who were flying with the British at that time. And the two planes were, I believe at the time, were brothers who were flying these aircraft. I can't verify this. I just have the vague notion I read this when I was doing the research for these and adding the markings. These are Newport 28s flown by the Americans after we got into the war, and they were supplied to us by the French, and we flew them for a short while. They were fairly reliable, but they had a tendency to shed the fabric on their top wing. Rickenbacker and most of the American aces flew these when they first got into the war, and they were shortly replaced by Spads. This is a painting of a Halberstadt German plane and two Sopwith Camels flown by Americans. The closest Sopwith Camel is George Vaughan's aircraft. This is a dogfight in which the Halberstadt didn't win, and it was one of George Vaughan's. He shared a victory shared by George Vaughan and his wingman. And I did a different version of this. It's in the Air Force Art Collection that you see the viewpoint from the Sopwith Camels as opposed to the Halberstadt. Again, these are Newport 28s flown by the Americans. The one in the foreground, number 12, is Eddie Rickenbacker's plane. And the incident here is that Rickenbacker attacked this German Albatross, and you can see the Albatross is smoking. And Rickenbacker assumed that he shot this plane down. Well, he kind of shot it down. The pilot landed, and from what I understand, Rickenbacker met him years later after the war, so the man survived. This is a German observation plane, a Roland, sometimes called the Waldfish, because it looks kind of like a whale. And I did this primarily to try painting a village below it, and that seems to have come out okay, not bad. And it just was a fun painting to do. These are German false D3s, which was a pretty predominant aircraft during the war. A lot of the German squadrons flew these, and it's a pretty airplane. It's well designed, and I painted it just to get the mood here more than anything else. What they're going to do, your guess is as good as mine, and they just might be out of control doing nothing. But I had fun painting this. It's a pretty airplane, and that's what I was aiming for. This painting was done gee, almost 50 years ago now, and it was done for a calendar for the Society of World War I Aero Historians. And my good friend George Evans, who was a comic book artist and probably knew more about World War I aviation than anybody I ever knew, uh, had me do this calendar. And then this painting went to the Air Force Art Collection shortly after, and that started my association with them. This was used also as a calendar for the the Air Force Artist Association, and some other Air Force calendars. And it's basically Putnam's Red Spad, American pilot who happened to paint his airplane red, which wasn't really allowed, and he had to go back to the camouflage shortly after. This is a small painting, approximately 11 by 14 inches, and it's a study of a British aircraft, the SE-5, which was one of their standard fighters in World War I. Quite a nice little airplane. American pilots flew those too when they were flying with the British. And it was just an interesting study in color and light. So enjoy this. This is a Sopwith triplane. They were in service for a short period of time, primarily with the Royal Naval Air Service. And I just had good information on the triplane, and I wanted to do a painting of it. So basically what you're doing is looking directly down at the ground, and this guy has encountered a Albatross D3, and I've titled this more or less The Dance Begins, because you know these guys are going to be flitting around the air trying to get on each other's tail to shoot the other down. The end results are unknown, and you can draw your own conclusions. This is a painting of William Dunn's Hawker Hurricane. Dunn became the first American ace in World War II, flying with the Eagle Squadron, but didn't get much credit for it until long after the war. And primarily what this is Hurricanes coming back from a sortie, landing at their airfield somewhere in England, which was usually in the middle of farm fields somewhere, as noted with the farmer and his wife back there plowing the fields. We lived near the Chesapeake Bay. I had painted a great deal of paintings of various workboats of the Chesapeake, and one of them is a skipjack, which this is. And talking to friends of mine who were pilots, we noted that flying over the water, there wasn't much height restriction. And these planes were coming out of Bowling Field in D.C., and we figured they would come out over the Chesapeake. And what pilot wouldn't want to buzz a skipjack? And that's what these guys are doing a fly around to this guy with his sail up, looking for oysters out on the Chesapeake Bay. This is a painting of a Air Cobra shooting down a Japanese plane. This is an actual incident that happened. The information of this particular plane is all on the side of the plane, the name of the plane, the pilot. And this is New Guinea. And even though the Air Cobra wasn't as good as a Zero, our guys managed to use them quite effectively in shooting down the Japanese. Later on, a lot of these were given to the Russians during the war, and they used them as tank busters because they did carry a cannon in the nose of the plane. So it was quite a sturdy little airplane. This is a plane out of the 15th Air Force in Italy, and I primarily wanted to show it over the Alps, and it's a portrait of a particular airplane, and with the markings and the name of it on the plane, American Beauty. And it was a study more than anything else. It's a large painting, and it is now part of the Air Force Art Collection. This is William Dunn's Spitfire. I had talked about his Hurricane earlier. They segued into Spitfires, and while doing so, Bill was able to shoot down 5 German aircraft, and this may be his ace kill. And shortly after this, he was wounded and went back into service again after the United States got into the war. But I love the Spitfire. It's a beautiful airplane. And we know that poor German guy is not going to make it. A lot of people don't realize that the United States Marine Corps had bombers during the war. And this is a B-25 Mitchell that the Marines flew in the South Pacific. As you can see, they're coming out of an island, a village below it. This is part of the United States Marine Corps' art collection, and this was shown at the Air and Space Museum when the Marines did their 100th anniversary of aviation a few years ago. And what was nice about it, as you walked into the show, here was this big painting of the bomber. And we went to see this with grandkids at the time. And it was just fun for them to actually see this. Chuck Yeager in his P-51 Glamorous Glennis prior to the time he became the man that broke the sound barrier. And Yeager is one of the few American aces flying P-51s were able to shoot down any of the German Me-262 jets. And what this is Yeager has spotted this jet coming in for a landing. He dove on it, got behind it, and managed to shoot the guy down. The interesting thing is that years later, Yeager met the pilot who survived the crash. It's an interesting story, and Yeager, of course, is a very interesting guy. This is a depiction of a couple of the P-40s that got off the ground on December 7th, 1941, when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. And what this is a depiction of one of our guys shooting down a Japanese dive bomber. And the interesting thing about this is it's part of the Air Force art collection, and they chose to use this in a history of the Air Force art collection. It's one of my paintings that's in that book. And I just like this. It came together very well. So it's nice to see this here. Every painter has a few paintings that he or she doesn't want to get rid of. This is one I don't want to get rid of. I did this quite a few years ago. We have it hanging at home, and it's another one, a P-51 and a German Focke-Wulf. And the fellow that flew the P-51 was from New Mexico, titled his aircraft the Thunderbird. So I titled the whole thing the Thunderbird and the Wolf. And the Wolf probably lost out to the Thunderbird on this encounter. My late father-in-law was a submarine commander during the war, and my wife told me about this at the time, that he had this easy duty because he was down in the Caribbean. And I laughed. I said, "You have no idea that those guys were hunting German submarines who came in after the oil tankers." So I did a depiction of his submarine, and I had finished it and realized I needed something more in it. Then I went back and painted the Catalina in the sky, who's helping him scout for German submarines. This is one of my first forays into jets. I just don't do them, and since this is early, the Korean War, I said, yeah, it's close enough to World War II. I'll do this. And this is a depiction of an American Sabre jet going after a MiG. And once we got the Sabre jets, we were pretty good at knocking the Chinese MiGs out of the air. And you can see this guy is closing in on it and about ready to let loose with his 50 caliber machine guns. It was a commission. The fellow that wanted the painting done, his father had helped design this aircraft, which is an early Air Force cargo aircraft that could carry jeeps, tanks, and a lot of troops. And this is just a straightforward painting of it. It's a portrait, and that's what the guy wanted. So here it is. It's just a good study in reflections of light on aluminum. So it's a pretty neat painting. This is a painting of P-47 Thunderbolts who are going to escort the B-17 home. And the B-17 pilots and the crews refer to these guys as their little friends. If you'll take a close look at the B-17, you'll see that he's trailing smoke out of one wing, out of one of his engines. And these fellows will escort him to England to make sure that he isn't jumped by German aircraft and shot down. I think anybody that paints World War I aircraft eventually has to have a painting of Baron von Richthofen's red triplane, and I'm no different than anyone else. I'm fascinated by it. The guy was quite an ace, and what this is a painting of one of his triplanes. This may be the one that he ended his career in. I'm not sure, but there it is, bright red, against a couple of Sopwith Camels, and they may be the two that he got into the fight with that caused him to be shot down. But it's an interesting airplane, and everybody knows about it, and everybody can think of Snoopy and his Sopwith Camel going after the bloody Red Baron.